Hey guys, tonight we begin with a cold room that does not look much like a room at all. You duck through a low entrance, straighten slowly, and find yourself inside a broad circle of timber, grass, hides, earth, smoke, stored food, beds, tools, and people. Outside, the northern plains can punish exposed skin. Inside, there is a fire, but there is no brick chimney, no iron stove, no thermostat, and certainly no modern fireplace waiting politely against one wall. The surprise is that the fire is only part of the answer. Among the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara communities of the upper Missouri, warmth depended on the entire dwelling working together. Earth over the roof, a protected entrance, a central hearth, bedding around the outer ring, stored fuel, and several people sharing one enclosed volume. What looks primitive to modern eyes is actually a carefully managed thermal problem. And that gives us tonight's question. If the fire itself was small, smoky, and imperfect, what really kept winter from entering the bed with you? If you enjoy quiet history like this, you can like the video, subscribe, and comment with the place you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move farther into the lodge and notice the floor first. It is not a polished surface. It is packed earth beneath your feet, darkened by use. The center is open around a fire pit, and beyond it the sleeping places form a ring near the walls. At Knife River, National Park Service interpretation describes earthlodges roughly 30 to 60 feet across, with 10 to 20 occupants. The central fire organized daily life. But the useful part begins before anyone lights a flame. The roof above you carries weight. Timber supports branches, grass, and earth. Instead of building a thin shell and asking a fire to fight the whole winter, the structure slows the exchange between the interior and the weather outside. Wind cannot simply pass through the building. Cold air does not have a straight, open path from one wall to another. The lodge makes the fire's work easier before the fire does anything at all. NPS describes willow branches, dried prairie grass, and thick sod laid across the timber framework. That is the first broken modern assumption. You are used to thinking of heating as a machine. Turn it on, add fuel, raise the temperature. Heating begins with architecture. You walk toward the entrance and discover why. The entrance is not simply an unprotected hole facing the weather. Inside the reconstructed Knife River Lodge, a windbreak sits near the doorway. Every time someone comes in carrying wood, food, hides, or snow on their clothing, the cold wants to follow. The entrance slows it down. Now look upward. There is a hole in the roof because smoke has to leave. That creates an obvious problem. Warm air can leave too. You cannot simply seal the opening. Do that while the fire burns and your clever winter house becomes a smoke experiment with relatives. So the opening has to be managed rather than eliminated. MPS interpretation at Knife River describes an old bullboat being turned over the smoke hole during heavy rain or snow, propped so smoke could still escape. A hide boat used on the river can become weather protection over the roof. One object, two jobs. And neither job involves pretending winter has gone away. The lodge accepts a controlled leak because breathing matters more than perfect heat retention. That trade-off will keep appearing tonight. Warmth is not the same thing as sealing yourself inside a box. Fire needs oxygen. Smoke needs an exit. People cook. Damp clothing dries. Snow comes through doors. Fuel runs out. Someone has to get more. The problem is never simply cold. The problem is managing cold without creating a worse problem. You step back toward the beds. They sit around the outer ring between the support poles, away from the central working space. Hides and bedding create smaller pockets of comfort around the body. A person under skins does not need every cubic foot of the lodge to feel like a modern living room. The important space is the space close to the body. NPS records beds arranged around that outer ring, with storage beneath and around them. That changes the scale of the challenge. Modern heating encourages you to warm rooms nobody is using. An earth lodge does not have that luxury. Labour has to cut or gather fuel. Fuel has to be carried. Fire has to be tended. Smoke has to be tolerated. Every extra degree has a cost in work. So people concentrate warmth where life actually happens. Around the hearth. Around food. Around beds. Around other people. 10 or 20 people are not a furnace, but they are not thermally irrelevant. More importantly, they mean that heat-producing activities are concentrated in one shared enclosure. Cooking happens there, work happens there, conversation happens there, rest happens there. The structure gathers tasks instead of distributing them across separate heated rooms. That arrangement saves something even more valuable than warmth. It saves fuel and labour. And once you notice labour, the house begins to look different. The earth on the roof did not climb there by itself. The timbers did not arrange themselves. Grass had to be cut. Earth moved. Posts set. Roofs maintained. Firewood gathered. Bedding prepared. Smoke holes adjusted. The NPS notes that women owned and maintained Hidatsa earth lodges, supervised construction knowledge, and carried out much of the building work. A finished lodge could take roughly 7 to 10 days to complete, and might be rebuilt about every 10 years. A warm winter night therefore begins long before the temperature drops. It begins in construction season. It begins with materials. It begins with knowing wind, weight, dryness, repair, and how much labour a household can spend. Then there is another complication. Not every winter night was spent in the same kind of lodge. Historical work on Mandan and Hidatsa villages notes that large permanent villages were only part of the annual pattern. People also used smaller winter camps in wooded river bottoms, places that offered protection from harsh winter storms. Those winter structures could be less elaborate than the large village lodges. So even the earth lodge cannot become our universal answer. The deeper answer is movement between solutions. A large lodge solves one set of problems: storage, family life, ceremony, trade, and long-term residence. A winter camp can solve another: proximity to fuel, hunting, shelter from exposed winds, and seasonal needs. Warmth is therefore not one invention. It is a chain of decisions. Where do you build? What do you build with? How much air do you allow to move? Where do you sleep? Where is the fuel? Who carries it? What must stay dry? What can be shared? And what happens when the weather changes faster than your plan? By now, the small central fire looks less impressive than it did when you entered. That is exactly the point. The fire is visible, so modern eyes give it all the credit. The real system is harder to see because it is spread across the roof, the entrance, the beds, the stored wood, the people, the work, and the landscape outside. The flame is only the bright part. The rest of the warmth is built into the life around it. And before this night is over, that distinction will take us somewhere even less obvious. Into homes where the shape, sleeping platform, wall lining, and placement of several fires could matter as much as the flame itself. Haudenosaunee longhouses, for example, used shared hearths, raised sleeping platforms, and wall linings of mats or furs as parts of a very different household arrangement. You leave the round earth lodge behind and walk east, across a different landscape, and into a different architectural problem. The next doorway is low again, but what rises beyond it is long rather than circular. A Haudenosaunee longhouse could stretch far beyond the dimensions of an ordinary modern house, yet remain only about 20 feet wide. Its length expanded with the extended family that lived inside. The structure was built from posts, poles, saplings, bark, lashings, mats, and hides. Along the middle ran an aisle. Fires sat in that aisle at intervals, and family spaces faced them from both sides. At first, this seems like the opposite of efficiency. More building means more air to warm. More people mean more doors opening, more cooking, more smoke, more movement, more chances for heat to escape. But the longhouse was not heated like a modern open-plan home. It was divided by use. Each stretch of the central aisle served neighbouring family compartments. A fire in the middle supplied heat, cooking, and light to the families facing it. Sleeping and working platforms occupied the sides, storage filled spaces above, below, and around them. Instead of asking one fireplace at the end of a huge room to warm everything evenly, the interior repeated a smaller unit again and again. Fire, families, sleeping space, storage, then another fire farther along. You can feel the difference as soon as you sit down. The most useful warmth is close. The fire is only a few steps away. Behind you, the outer wall can be lined with woven mats or furs. Beneath and around the platform are materials and stored goods. Above, another shelf narrows the family cubicle. The entire longhouse may be large, but the space your body occupies is much smaller. That matters because winter comfort does not require uniform temperature. It requires a tolerable body temperature. Modern central heating trains you to expect the hallway, kitchen, bedroom, and empty corner to sit within a narrow temperature range. A longhouse had no reason to obey that expectation. The centre aisle could be smoky. The area near a doorway could be colder. The upper air could hold more smoke and rising heat. Your sleeping place could be arranged for warmth even when the entire building was not. Early descriptions collected by the New York State Museum make this especially clear. Some observers reported that people changed where they slept with the season. In warmer weather, raised platforms could be useful. In winter, people might sleep lower and closer to the fire. Lower sounds wrong until you remember the smoke. Warm air rises, but so does smoke. If you climb toward the roof because you want warmth, your eyes and lungs may object before the cold does. One 17th century description noted heavy smoke inside these houses and serious eye irritation. Another described low sleeping arrangements partly as a way to remain beneath the worst of it. So the warmest possible place is not automatically the best place. Again, the solution carries a cost. Above each fire, an opening in the roof allowed smoke to escape and admitted some daylight. Bark sheets could be moved over the opening during bad weather or troublesome winds. Close it too much and smoke collects. Open it too much and rain, snow, wind and heat loss become larger problems. You are adjusting a building by hand. No damper handle. No sealed flue. Just bark, wind, judgment and experience. And because the opening serves both light and ventilation, one change affects several needs at once. A cold, clear day, wet snow, a shifting wind, and a crowded evening do not create the same interior conditions. Someone has to notice. Someone has to act. This is where the longhouse stops looking like a static object and starts looking like maintained technology. The bark walls need to remain secure against wind. The framework needs repair. Mats and furs have to be kept usable. Firewood must remain dry enough to burn. The hearth needs fuel. The smoke opening needs management. The entrance must function while limiting exposure. Warmth comes from a building, but only because people keep making the building work. Look beneath the sleeping platform. Firewood can be stored there. That is not decorative storage. It shortens the distance between fuel and flame while helping keep an essential winter resource inside the protected structure. Other possessions can occupy shelves overhead. Corn and food stores may hang or sit in designated areas. Space is doing several jobs at once, because every job placed inside the enclosure is one less task that requires unnecessary exposure outside. The architecture concentrates winter life. You cook where you warm yourself. You work near where you cook. You store fuel near where you sleep. You share a hearth instead of duplicating one for every person. And you sleep beside relatives whose own daily activity adds movement, work, and some body heat to the same family space. The social arrangement matters as much as the bark. A fire in the centre of a compartment was commonly shared by two families, one on either side of the aisle. In larger longhouses, this pattern repeated along the building. The hearth therefore sat inside a relationship. It had users, responsibilities, competing needs, children nearby, cooking demands, fuel demands, and smoke that everybody had to tolerate. Heat was shared because space was shared. That does not mean life inside was automatically cozy. Contemporary descriptions can be quite blunt about smoke, insects, dampness, crowding, and discomfort. Some of those descriptions were written by European visitors who carried their own prejudices and often used language we would reject today. The New York State Museum itself warns that these records survive through different translations and interpretations. Archaeological postmolds can show us dimensions and layouts with far less attitude, but they cannot tell us exactly how every winter night felt. That evidence limit matters. It prevents us from turning a working house into a romantic survival machine. People were not warm because they possessed a secret immunity to cold. They changed bedding, sleeping position, fuel use, ventilation, building materials, and daily behavior because cold remained a real physical pressure. And different Haudenosaunee communities did not freeze their architecture in time. By the 18th century, some families were living in shorter houses, while traditional longhouse forms continued in other settings. Household size, village life, available materials, politics, and contact with Europeans all affected what was built. The useful lesson is not that one ancient design defeated winter forever. It is that warmth was adjustable. You could move closer to the fire. You could move lower. You could add mats or furs. You could shift a bark cover above the smoke opening. You could retrieve dry wood from beneath the platform. You could reorganize where people slept. And the house itself could grow, shrink, or change as the family using it changed. The structure worked because it was not separate from behavior. That is the second piece of tonight's larger answer. First, on the upper Missouri, earth and mass slowed the cold, while a central hearth served a densely used interior. Here, in a Haudenosaunee longhouse, repeated hearths, family compartments, wall linings, sleeping levels, stored fuel, and adjustable openings created another system entirely. Different house, different materials, same deeper rule. Do not ask the flame to solve a problem the building, the body, and the household can solve first. And that rule becomes even clearer when the house itself is designed to move. The next house does something the earthlodge cannot. It disappears. By morning, the poles can be down, the cover folded, the household packed, and the camp moving across the plains. That mobility changes the heating problem completely. You cannot depend on tons of earth overhead or a wall that took days to build. The shelter has to be light enough to move, fast enough to raise again, and still useful when the temperature drops. For many plains peoples, the teepee answered that problem, though not in one universal form. National Park Service documentation notes that teepee construction varied among nations, including differences in the arrangement of the foundation poles. It also distinguishes larger camp teepees from smaller travel teepees. A structure built for movement was not a single standardized object copied across the plains. You enter an apshalaga or crow lodge, and the first thing you notice is that the wall is not really one wall. There is the outer lodge covering. Then there is a liner inside. That second layer changes how the air behaves. Montana Historical Society teaching material based on crow sources describes the teepee liner as an inner wall that creates a space between itself and the outer cover. Air can move upward through that space toward the smoke opening instead of simply washing across the occupied floor. The liner is therefore doing more than hiding the lower poles. It helps organize draft. That matters immediately because a teepee needs an opening at the top. A fire without ventilation fills a shelter with smoke. A large open hole, however, also gives wind and warm air a path. The answer is not to choose between ventilation and warmth. The structure tries to control both. Look up. On some northern plains teepees, 2 smoke flaps could be adjusted from outside with movable poles. National Park Service documentation describing Sioux teepees notes that these flaps sat around the smoke opening and could be repositioned. The cone itself was not necessarily symmetrical. Its shape, opening, and movable parts worked together around wind and smoke. So the roof is not just a roof. It is also part of the ventilation system. Now kneel closer to the ground. This is where the modern eye usually makes another mistake. You see the central fire and assume the whole interior must become evenly warm. It does not need to. The people closest to the floor care about the layer of air around their bodies, their bedding, their clothing, and the immediate space between the liner and the hearth. The warmest strategy is not necessarily a spectacular blaze. A larger fire consumes more fuel, throws more sparks, produces more smoke, and demands more ventilation. A smaller, controlled fire can be more useful when the shelter already reduces direct drafts around the occupied lower zone. That is an inference from how the liner and smoke opening work together, not proof that every family kept the same size fire. Different weather, fuel, household size, and local practice would change the balance. And now the hide beneath your hand becomes part of the answer. Crow oral history recorded through Pretty Shield describes lodge furnishings that included beds covered with robes. The same Montana Historical Society material explains the labor of tanning hides and their use for clothing, moccasins, lodge coverings, and other household goods. Warmth therefore did not stop at the wall. It continued inward through clothing and bedding that trapped heat much closer to the body. This is a recurring principle. Do not heat empty air if you can protect the person instead. You sit on a bed covered with a robe, feet tucked closer to the central fire. Behind you is the liner. Beyond that is the outer cover. Above you is the smoke opening. The layers are not equivalent to modern insulated walls, and the interior is not a sealed room. But each layer changes what the cold air must do before it reaches your skin. The body is the final room. That sounds simple until you look at the work required to create it. Pretty Shield, an Apshalaka woman whose recollections became an important source on Crow life, described women caring for children, cooking and drying meat, dressing robes, tanning skins, making clothing, making lodges and moccasins, pitching and taking down the lodges, packing horses and travois, and gathering wood for fires. That list changes the meaning of staying warm. The warmth begins with somebody cutting or obtaining poles. Somebody prepares hides. Somebody sews the cover. Somebody makes the liner. Somebody gathers fuel. Somebody pitches the lodge correctly. Somebody adjusts the interior after the move. And when the camp moves again, somebody takes the entire thermal system apart. Montana Historical Society material says Pretty Shield recalled that a crow teepee could require roughly 12 to 20 large tanned hides for its covering. With crow lodges using many poles, a skilled woman responsible for shaping and fitting the covering could be known as a lodge cutter. The fit mattered enough that crow women had a complement for a covering that sat especially well on its frame. The heating system begins in craftsmanship. A loose, poorly arranged cover is not merely ugly, it changes the behavior of wind, smoke, and rain. A badly placed opening can create trouble. A liner hung incorrectly cannot guide airflow as intended. Knowledge lives in hands long before it appears as warmth. Then comes the problem that no fixed fireplace ever faces. You have to carry your house. Before horses became available, plains peoples could use dogs with travois to transport belongings. Later, horses greatly expanded carrying capacity and mobility. The same Crow educational sources describe travois made from poles and explain how moving camp involved packing households, as well as taking lodges down. This means every heating improvement has a weight. Add more material, and someone or some animal must move it. Use heavier poles, and transport becomes harder. Carry more robes, and you gain insulation but also bulk. Carry more fuel, and you reduce the danger of reaching a poor campsite, but you spend transport capacity on wood rather than food, tools, hides, or other necessities. Mobility forces warmth to compete with everything else. That is why the teepee is more interesting than the old phrase, portable home, suggests. It is a compromise machine. It gives up the massive thermal inertia of an earth lodge. In return, it lets the household relocate. It cannot behave like a sealed, stove-heated room. In return, its adjustable openings and liner help manage fire and smoke inside a much smaller occupied space. Its covering is lighter than a wall of earth. In return, robes and clothing have to do more work close to the body. And its usefulness depends on people knowing how to pitch, maintain, pack, carry, and rebuild it repeatedly. The fireplace has almost vanished from our question now. There is still a flame in the centre, but the real warmth is distributed across skills, the lodge cutter's fit, the liner's position, the smoke flaps overhead, the robe across the bed, the moccasins on your feet, the wood brought in before darkness, the decision about when to move and where to stop. A modern fireplace is a permanent object attached to a permanent room. This system can be rolled up. And once warmth can move with you, the next question is no longer how to heat one shelter. It is how to choose the landscape that makes heating easier before the shelter even goes up. The lodge comes down, but the wind does not. You step outside into a plains winter and immediately understand why the next decision can matter as much as the shelter itself. A well-made lodge can slow drafts, guide smoke, protect bedding, and concentrate heat. Put that lodge on an exposed rise with no nearby fuel, however, and you have volunteered to make every other part of the night harder. So before anyone thinks about the fire, someone has already been thinking about the ground. Among the Mandan and Hidatsa of the upper Missouri, the seasonal pattern makes this unusually clear. Their large villages occupied more permanent locations, but winter camps could shift into wooded river bottoms. National Park Service interpretation describes Hidatsa winter lodges as smaller than the large summer earth lodges and places them in thick woods along the Missouri river bottoms. Historian James Ronda likewise notes that Mandan and Hidatsa winter lodges were built in wooded bottoms partly to escape harsh winter storms. The important object here is not inside the house. It is the tree line. You walk down from open country toward the bottomland. The air does not magically become warm, but the character of the wind changes. Trunks, brush, banks, uneven ground, and the lower position of the camp break the clean sweep of exposed prairie. A winter lodge placed there begins with less moving air attacking it than one standing alone on open ground. That is not insulation in the narrow sense. It is avoidance. And avoidance can be cheaper than resistance. Every gust that never reaches the lodge is heat you do not have to replace with firewood. Every trip for fuel that becomes shorter is less time spent outside and less labour spent hauling wood through snow or frozen ground. The landscape is doing part of the work before the first spark is made. Now look around the winter camp. Wood is not merely scenery, it is stored energy standing upright. A central fire consumes fuel continuously. Cooking consumes fuel. Drying damp material may require additional heat. A cold spell extends the hours when people want fire. If the nearest useful wood lies far away, warmth becomes a transportation problem. Someone must leave shelter, find material, cut or break it, move it, keep it dry enough to burn, and do the same thing again tomorrow. That changes what a warm house means. It means a house located near the things that keep it warm. The Hidatsa example gives us another useful correction. Their winter lodges in the river bottoms were not simply miniature versions of the great summer structures built with equal care. Historical summaries describe them as smaller and less elaborate. That makes sense within a seasonal system. A structure intended for a winter camp did not have to solve every problem faced by a long-term village lodge. It needed to solve the problems of that season, in that location. For as long as the camp would be used, you trade permanence for position. The summer village may offer fields, storage, trade, social concentration, and durable architecture. The winter site can move closer to timber and better shelter from storms. One place does not have to be best at everything. This is a larger pattern worth holding on to. because it keeps us away from the idea of a single perfect Native American winter house. There was no continent-wide thermostat strategy. Different peoples worked with different climates, materials, settlement patterns, food systems, and forms of mobility. Even within one society, the shelter used during one season could differ from the shelter used during another. The correct question is not, what house did Native Americans use? It is, what combination of house, location, clothing, fuel, bedding, work, and movement made sense here? You crouch beside a fire ring as daylight fades. The site itself contains an archaeological problem. A stone circle, charcoal stain, post mould, or cluster of burned rock may tell researchers the people camped and made fires here. It does not automatically tell us how cold everyone felt, how large the flame was, who fetched the wood, or exactly how people arranged themselves during one particular storm. National Park Service archaeological documentation from the Upper Missouri Corridor notes campsites near terraces, stream confluences, springs, hearth remains, and stone rings. But those remains are evidence of occupation and activity, not a diary of comfort. That limit is useful. It forces us to separate what the landscape can show from what we merely want it to say. The winter camp evidence is stronger when historical descriptions, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge line up around a practical pattern. People were not randomly dropping shelters onto an empty plain. Camps existed within landscapes used for water, resources, travel, seasonal occupation, and protection. Along the Upper Missouri, archaeological surveys repeatedly locate camps near rivers, tributaries, springs, terraces, and other useful features. Warmth was one demand among several. You cannot camp only for warmth if the site leaves you without food. You cannot choose only for fuel if the place exposes horses, stores, or people to some larger danger. You cannot bury yourself so deeply in shelter that movement becomes impossible. The best winter site is therefore not the warmest imaginable point on a map. It is the place where enough needs can be met at once. That is the same logic we saw inside the teepee. The smoke hole could not be perfectly sealed because people needed to breathe and the fire needed draft. The lodge could not become infinitely heavy because it had to move. Bedding could not solve everything because somebody still had to leave it. Now the same compromise expands outward until the entire landscape is part of the room. A wooded bottom becomes a windbreak. A nearby stand of timber becomes a fuel reserve. A river becomes water, route, resource zone, and geographical organizer. A bank or low ground can alter exposure. The camp is not placed on top of the environment. It is fitted into it. And fitting matters most when the weather becomes extreme. During the winter of 1804 to 1805, near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, the Lewis and Clark expedition recorded repeated severe cold. A later analysis of those records counts 40 sunrise readings below 0 Fahrenheit during December, January, and February, with another 2 in March. One December sunrise was recorded at 45 below. The instruments were not modern meteorological equipment, so individual numbers deserve caution. But the record leaves little doubt that the winter was brutally cold. At 40 below, clever phrasing stops helping. Distance matters. Fuel matters. Wind matters. Dryness matters. How quickly you can return indoors matters. The house has not changed, but its relationship to everything outside has become brutally visible. You carry another armful of wood toward the lodge. It is heavier now because you know what it represents. Not just fire, time, calories. Distance, knowledge of where to look. Knowledge of what will burn, a decision made hours before the flames shrink. That is why winter warmth cannot be reduced to architectural diagrams. A diagram can show the poles, liner, hearth, wall, or smoke opening. It cannot show the repeated paths between the dwelling and its fuel. It cannot show the decision to leave an exposed site and establish a winter camp in timber. It cannot show how much of staying warm happens outside the house. By the time you duck through the entrance again, the fire seems smaller than ever. The landscape has become the larger heating system. And that creates the next problem. Even the best campsite and the best shelter cannot keep you indoors forever. Sooner or later, your body has to step back into winter. You step through the doorway and the cold reaches for the easiest places first. Your face feels it. Your hands feel it. Then your feet begin reporting every patch of frozen ground beneath them. The lodge can shelter you while you are inside, but it cannot follow you to the woodpile, the river, a hunt, a neighbouring camp, or any other task that winter refuses to cancel. So the heating system contracts again. Now it is wrapped around your body. Among the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara of the upper Great Plains, bison supplied much of the material for clothing, as well as sinew for sewing. National Park Service interpretation at Knife River calls the buffalo robe a basic article of clothing. Leggings, moccasins, shirts, dresses, and other garments added protection in different ways, but the robe is a useful place to begin because it could surround a large part of the body at once. You pull one around your shoulders. Immediately, the problem changes from heating the air around you to slowing the heat leaving you. The robe does not create warmth. Your body does that. What the robe gives you is a thicker boundary between skin and winter. That distinction is easy to miss because modern heating puts so much attention on the source of heat. Yet once you are outside, the source is you. And the colder it gets, the more valuable that trapped warmth becomes. Bison hides were not all identical through the year. National Park Service research on the 19th century robe trade notes that hides taken in the colder months carried the dense hair wanted for cold weather uses. Traders valued prime winter robes especially highly. That commercial record is later than many of the practices we are following tonight, and it reflects traders' priorities, but it confirms something physically obvious to the people processing the animals. Season changed the hide. A winter robe therefore begins months before you wrap yourself in it. First there is the hunt. Then there is an enormous piece of fresh hide that is heavy, wet, stiff, and nowhere near ready to become comfortable bedding or clothing. It has to be worked. At Bent's Old Fort, the National Park Service summarizes 19th century observations of Cheyenne women processing bison robes. The hide was stretched, pegged down, scraped thinner, treated, softened, and smoked. Contemporary observers estimated that preparing a single robe could consume many days of labor. One estimate gave an average around 10 days. Those observers were outsiders, and their descriptions belonged to a commercial robe trade setting, not to every plains community or every earlier century. But the labor itself is impossible to overlook. Warmth had a work schedule. Someone had to turn animal skin into material soft enough to wrap around a sleeping person. Someone had to scrape without cutting through it. Someone had to soften it. Someone had to sew other hides into clothing and lodge covers. And that work was heavily carried by women in the plains communities documented by these sources. The warm object in your hands is therefore stored labor as much as stored insulation. Now look down at your feet. A robe can cover your shoulders while your toes still become miserable. Knife River documentation gives a particularly clear winter adjustment. Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara moccasins could be made larger in winter so that fur or grasses could be placed inside as insulation. Winter versions could also have higher flaps, while leggings could help protect the foot and ankle in deep snow. That is a tiny architectural trick. Make the outer shell larger. Put another material inside it. Create a protected pocket around the foot. The same logic that gave the teepee a liner now appears around your toes. Different scale, same problem. Even the moccasin sole reveals how carefully materials were reused. NPS interpretation describes one source for hard soles as old sections from the upper part of teepee covers. After years above household fires, that hide had absorbed smoke and could become highly resistant to water. Soft-tanned elk, deer, or sometimes antelope hide could form the upper, with sinew serving as thread. The worn-out house can become part of the shoe. Nothing about that is sentimental. It is practical. A useful material has already survived weather, tension, smoke, packing, and repeated handling. When it stops serving one job well, part of it can still serve another. You take another step through the snow. Now the difference between a fireplace and a clothing system becomes sharp. A fireplace protects you only while you remain near it. A robe travels, moccasins travel, leggings travel. The protection moves when work moves. That portability is essential because daily life keeps pulling people across the boundary between warm and cold. Firewood does not walk into the lodge. Water does not always arrive by itself. Animals have to be hunted. Equipment has to be repaired. Children have to be cared for. Camps move. Food is processed. Neighbours visit. A winter adaptation that functions only beside the hearth solves too little. There is also no reason to imagine perfect comfort. Hands still become cold. Faces remain exposed. Snow can enter clothing. A long trip can outlast the warmth you carried from the lodge. Feet are particularly unforgiving because every step places them against cold ground while sweat and snow threaten the insulating materials around them. The historical sources tell us that fur and grasses were added inside winter footwear. Basic heat transfer tells us why protecting that small space mattered. What the sources do not give us is one universal recipe for exactly which grass, how much fur, or how every family arranged it in every season. That uncertainty belongs in the story. Native winter clothing was knowledge, not a standardized product line. Materials changed by region. Animals changed. Weather changed. Trade changed what was available. Individual skill changed the result. And clothing could communicate age, identity, achievement, ceremony, and social meaning, while still performing the ordinary job of keeping a body protected. The robe itself proves that these functions overlapped. Knife River interpretation describes robes as clothing, but also records pattern decoration and specific ways of draping them during social situations. An object can keep out cold and still say something about the person wearing it. Warmth is never purely thermal once humans get involved. It becomes material culture, work, identity, care, access, and eventually. By the 19th century, bison robes were moving through a commercial network far larger than the households that made them. Fort Union and Bent's Fort handled enormous quantities of robes, while manufactured cloth, blankets, metal tools, beads, and other goods travelled in the opposite direction. Native families incorporated new materials rather than simply abandoning old ones. That exchange will matter later because a material that keeps you warm can also become something another economy desperately wants. For now, you turn back toward the lodge. Your robe closes tighter. The winter moccasins leave a short trail behind you. The central fire appears through the entrance, small and orange. You understand it differently now. The flame did not keep you warm while you were away. People had already carried part of the fire's job onto your body. And once you return inside, there is another quiet problem waiting beside the hearth. A fire that warms the night has to survive the night. The fire is still glowing when the lodge becomes quiet. Not roaring, glowing. That difference matters because a household does not need a theatrical blaze every minute of the night. A large flame is useful for cooking, light, quick warming, and some kinds of work. But flames also consume fuel quickly. Once people settle into robes and bedding, the better question is how much heat can be kept without wasting wood. You kneel beside the hearth. Ash lies around darker pieces of partly burned fuel beneath it. Some coals may remain hot after the visible flames fall. There is nothing uniquely native about that physical fact. What matters historically is how a household designed around an open hearth could use slow-burning fuel while accepting that routines varied by community, season, and family. The sources rarely give us a minute-by-minute account of who touched which log at 2 in the morning. That silence matters. We can document central hearths in Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara earthlodges. We can document repeated hearths in Haudenosaunee longhouses. We can document smoke openings, stored wood, beds, and winter architecture. But claiming that one particular person always woke at one particular hour would be invention. So stay with what the evidence can show. Firewood had to be close. In descriptions of Haudenosaunee longhouses preserved by the New York State Museum, the outer vestibule could be closed with bark during winter and used as a woodshed for heavy wood. That sounds like storage. It is really a winter system. Fuel is already undercover. The person tending a hearth does not need to walk far into snow or wind every time the fire drops. The labour of gathering has been moved earlier, before the moment of need. Cold rewards preparation. You lift a piece of wood from the vestibule and carry it toward the nearest hearth. Now the size of the longhouse matters again. Several fires might run along the central aisle, each serving neighbouring family compartments. That creates repeated warm zones rather than relying on one enormous blaze to reach the entire structure. It also creates repeated demand. One fire needs wood, then another farther down the aisle. A longhouse can concentrate families and work, but it does not make fuel free. The pressure becomes even clearer where wood is scarce. Lewis and Clark's records from the Columbia and Snake River region describe native communities carefully gathering and stacking available wood. Historian James Ronda notes that among the Wallulas, an offer of scarce firewood could carry real value as hospitality. A pile of sticks can therefore hold social value because everybody understands the labour inside it. You can burn that value in an evening. This is the hidden cost of every warm interior we have entered. Insulation reduces heat loss. Clothing protects the body. A sheltered campsite weakens the wind. But some heat still escapes, and replacing it consumes something physical. The important point is not a catalogue of every fuel used across North America. It is the chain of work between landscape and hearth. Find, gather, carry, store, protect, feed, repeat. Now think back to the wooded Missouri bottoms. Choosing a winter camp near timber shortened this chain. Mandan and Hidatsa winter lodges were built in wooded bottoms that offered protection from harsh storms, placing households within a landscape that also gave access to wood. The winter landscape was not only something to hide from, it was also the supply system. And supply becomes more serious when the cold deepens. During the winter of 1804 to 1805, the men at Fort Mandan recorded repeated temperatures below 0 Fahrenheit. One December account noted frost inside a guard chimney, even though a fire had been kept there all night. That was not a native lodge. We should not pretend it was, but it tells us something about the environment shared by the fort and nearby Mandan and Hidatsa communities. In severe cold, even continuous fire does not create modern indoor conditions. A flame can burn through the night, and winter can still leave frost within a structure. The goal was not to erase winter. The goal was to remain functional inside it. That distinction changes how you read the hearth. A person sleeping beneath robes does not need the air near the roof to feel warm. A person close to a protected sleeping space does not need the doorway to be comfortable. A household can let the fire decline while clothing, bedding, architecture and shared space continue doing work after the flames shrink. Then morning reverses the process. People rise. Movement increases. Cooking resumes. The entrance opens more often. Tasks begin pulling bodies outside. The hearth becomes working infrastructure again. Heat is not one setting maintained for 24 hours. It follows the rhythm of the household. That rhythm also explains why the hearth cannot be separated from food. The same fire that warms hands can heat a cooking vessel. It can provide light after sunset and help with tasks inside the dwelling. Every piece of fuel can therefore serve more than one purpose. Efficiency here is not a laboratory number. It is usefulness stacked on usefulness. A modern furnace is mostly allowed to be a furnace. An open hearth has a busier job description. And because it sits in the middle of domestic life, tending it cannot be understood only as thermal management. The hearth organizes movement. People approach it to cook. Smoke changes where bodies prefer to sit. Sparks limit where combustible materials can safely go. Fuel, tools, and vessels gather near it. The fire makes a map inside the house. But it is a map with danger at the center. Open flame near bark, hides, wood, grass, mats, and bedding is useful precisely because it is controlled. More fire is not automatically better. That gives us another reason not to romanticize the glowing hearth. Someone has to pay attention. Not necessarily by sitting awake all night in every household. The sources do not justify that universal picture. But whenever a fire is active, fuel, smoke, sparks, cooking, and combustible surroundings create decisions. Add wood or wait. Adjust ventilation or reduce the flame. Move closer or pull back. Bring in more wood before dark or make another cold trip later. The sophistication is not one dramatic invention. It is hundreds of ordinary judgments that leave almost no archaeological trace. By dawn, the room may contain very little visible evidence of them. Ash, charcoal, a partly burned log, a stack of wood made smaller, warm bedding around sleeping bodies. These are quiet objects, yet they reveal why the answer to tonight's title keeps moving farther away from the fireplace. Warmth did not come from a single appliance. It came from reducing how much heat had to be made, bringing fuel closer before it was needed, using one fire for several jobs, and accepting that the interior would never behave like a modern heated room. Then morning arrives. The fire is useful again. But before anyone worries about warming the air, someone is already thinking about breakfast. And food will turn out to be part of the winter heating problem too. The first thing you notice is the smell of corn. Not fresh corn from a summer field. This is dried food returning to usefulness months after harvest. Kernels have survived the season because somebody planted them, guarded them, dried them, stored them, and kept enough back for later. The fire under the pot is doing something important, but the meal began long before the hearth was lit. At Knife River, Hidatsa agriculture demanded sustained work. National Park Service interpretation describes women as the primary caretakers of gardens, responsible for planting, weeding, watering, protecting, and harvesting crops. Corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers were grown in river-bottom gardens, with seeds from strong crops saved for the next year. These foods were valuable partly because they could be preserved and stored. You lean toward the pot. The heat rising from it reaches your face, but the more important heat will be produced after you eat. A human body does not stay warm simply because warm air touches the skin. It is continually producing heat through metabolism. In cold conditions, that means food is part of the thermal system in the most literal sense. The shelter reduces heat loss. Clothing slows it further. The body still has to supply the heat being conserved. So winter food security and winter warmth overlap. That does not mean a particular Mandan or Hidatsa family calculated calories with modern nutritional tables. There is no reason to force modern vocabulary into their mouths. The historical fact is more concrete. Villages stored food for winter and lean periods, and that food supported people when gardens were no longer producing. Now follow the corn backward. Before it reaches the cooking pot, it has to become dry enough to survive storage. Knife River interpretation describes drying stages built among the lodges. Meat, vegetables, and other products could be dried there before being put away. Some drying stages rose 2 levels high. The purpose was not decorative abundance. Removing moisture helped food last. Then the dried food moved out of sight. Cache pits turned the ground into storage. National Park Service teaching material for Knife River describes corn, beans, squash, and sunflower seeds being placed in cache pits, while other park interpretation notes that surplus food could be kept for winter or traded. Archaeologists still encounter these storage features around village sites. You stand over the opening of one. It is easy to overlook because it does not glow. No sparks, no smoke, no dramatic winter scene. Yet a filled cache pit may be more important to surviving February than an extra armful of wood. Fire can warm an empty stomach for only so long. The pit contains summer work converted into wintertime. Every basket of corn stored below ground represents hours that do not have to be spent searching for food during the coldest part of the year. Every dried squash or portion of meat available near the village can reduce exposure, uncertainty, and travel. Stored food does not merely feed the household, it changes what the household has to do outside. That is the hidden connection. A good winter system reduces unnecessary trips. Earlier, we saw firewood stored close to a longhouse hearth. Now the same logic appears in food. Bring future needs closer before the weather makes distance expensive. The Mandan villages along the Missouri show how large this system could become. At Double Ditch, National Park Service interpretation describes farming that produced surplus food for storage during lean periods and for trade with neighboring non-farming groups. Corn, beans and squash were major crops, while hunting supplied bison and other animals. The village therefore entered winter with more than houses. It entered with reserves. Those reserves had social consequences. Food could be eaten by the household, shared, given to people in need, or traded. Knife River interpretation explicitly notes that dried food stored in caches might also be given away or exchanged. The winter store was therefore not merely private fuel for one body. It sat inside networks of family obligation, hospitality, exchange, and risk. A poor harvest could tighten all of those relationships. A good one could strengthen them. And guarding the harvest required another layer of labor before winter arrived. Hidatsa garden fields were vulnerable to birds, animals, horses, theft, and raids. NPS accounts based on Buffalo Birdwoman describe fences, scarecrows, and raised watcher stages. During parts of the fall, field watching could begin before sunrise and continue until sunset. Think about the timing. The coldest night may arrive in January. The work that makes that night manageable may happen in August or September. Warmth is delayed labor. The same pattern appeared in hide preparation. A robe keeps you warm because somebody worked the hide earlier. A lodge blocks wind because somebody raised poles earlier. Fuel burns because somebody gathered it earlier. Food makes the pattern impossible to ignore. Winter punishes households for tasks left unfinished before winter. You pick up a dried kernel. It is small enough to vanish between two fingers. But an entire agricultural system sits behind it. Seed selection, soil, water, tools, fences, watching, harvest, drying, storage, cooking. NPS documentation based on Buffalo Birdwoman records antler rakes, bison scapular hoes, digging sticks, river water carried to gardens, and extensive work protecting the fields. And gender matters here too. For Hidatsa agriculture, documented through Buffalo Birdwoman and interpreted by the National Park Service, women held much of the knowledge and responsibility for the gardens. That means a large part of winter security rested on labor that older historical storytelling often pushed into the background while emphasizing hunting, warfare, or famous male leaders. The fire is visible. The garden work is months away. History has often made the same mistake as the modern eye. It looks toward the flame, but the quieter system is carrying more weight. Now the pot begins to simmer. The hearth has finally entered the process again. It turns stored ingredients into a meal and performs another useful job while warming the dwelling. Cooking and heating overlap around the same fire, just as drying, storage, and household labor overlap across the seasons. Nothing is doing only one thing. That is why the system can function without a modern fireplace. A central hearth is less specialized than a modern heating appliance, but the surrounding household is more integrated. The fire cooks, the house slows heat loss, clothing protects the body, stored food powers the body, the landscape supplies fuel, labor connects all of them. And this is where the title begins to change. Staying warm sounds like a problem that begins when the temperature falls. For these communities, much of the answer was already decided before winter arrived. The walls were built, the hides were worked, the wood was gathered, the corn was dried, the cache was filled, the seed for next year was set aside. By the time snow presses against the lodge, winter survival is partly an audit of earlier choices. You lift the bowl, warm steam touches your face. Outside, the ground is hard and dark. Inside, a harvest from another season is being eaten beside a fire made from stored wood, under a roof built long before the storm. The cold is still there, but it has been answered in advance. And once winter becomes a problem of preparation, another difference appears. Not everyone had equal access to the same food, labor, shelter, or stored wealth. Warmth also had a social structure. You do not enter the next winter house alone. That sounds obvious, but it changes almost everything. A modern heating system is easy to imagine as personal property. You own a house, you own a furnace, you pay for fuel, you turn a control on the wall and expect a private room to respond. In the communities we have been following, warmth was often organized through a household instead. At Knife River, the National Park Service describes Hidatsa earthlodges as homes where cooking, sewing, parenting, sleeping, storage, and other daily work happened together. Multiple generations could share a lodge. More importantly, traditional Hidatsa earthlodges were owned and maintained by women. An older woman with the necessary sacred and practical knowledge could supervise construction, while other women and men contributed different parts of the work. So the roof over your head belongs inside a social relationship before it belongs inside a heating diagram. You sit near the wall on a bed covered with robes. Across the lodge, someone prepares food. Another person works with material near the light. Children move through the same space. The central fire serves all of them. Nobody has a private chimney for the sleeping platform. That arrangement creates dependency. Your warmth depends partly on work you did not personally perform. Perhaps someone else helped build the lodge. Someone processed the robe beneath you. Someone tended a garden whose food is now stored nearby. Someone brought in wood. Someone understands how the roof should be repaired. The household pools these tasks because winter does not care whether every individual can perform every job. This is where the phrase social structure becomes physical. It is a post holding up a roof. It is stored corn. It is a robe on a bed. It is the person who knows how to repair the place where snowmelt has begun to seep through. National Park Service interpretation of the Knife River villages emphasizes that earth lodges were centers of family life as well as structures built and owned by village women. The park also describes the villages as major trade centers long before the arrival of American fur companies. Garden produce, hides, clothing, tools, stone, horses, and later European manufactured goods moved through networks connecting different peoples. Trade could therefore alter the winter household without replacing its older logic. A metal tool can make some work easier. A woven blanket can become another useful layer. A traded hide can enter the same world of bedding, clothing, storage, and exchange. But a new object does not suddenly make the household independent. It has to be obtained. That requires relationships, surplus, skill, travel, bargaining, or access to people who already possess it. The source of warmth changes. The dependency does not disappear. Now move east again into a Haudenosaunee longhouse. The architecture makes kinship visible in another way. The New York State Museum describes the longhouse design as reflecting Haudenosaunee social organization. Family compartments lined the sides, while hearths in the central aisle could serve families facing one another. Longhouses were not simply containers filled with unrelated people. They were built around extended family relationships. That means a hearth has a social geography. Sit on one side and you're in somebody's family space. Cross the aisle and you are beside another. Walk farther and another hearth appears, serving another cluster. Warmth is repeated along the house because households are repeated along the house. The building turns kinship into distance. This does not prove that every person received identical food, bedding, attention, or comfort. Historical and archaeological evidence rarely lets us measure winter comfort person by person. We should not invent a neat hierarchy in which one social rank is always warm and another always cold. But equality of temperature would be just as imaginary. Beds differed. Household size differed. Stored supplies differed. Age, health, work, travel, and circumstance differed. A person recovering from illness. A child. An elder. A visitor. Or someone returning wet from outside did not present the same thermal problem. What we can say more securely is that protection was distributed through relationships. You did not merely need objects. You needed access to the people, skills, spaces, food, and stored material that made those objects useful. That becomes especially visible when surplus enters the story. At Knife River, women's agricultural production supported both household consumption and trade. NPS educational material notes that people came considerable distances for the crops grown in these villages. Food preserved by drying, smoking, and cache storage could carry a household through lean periods, but surplus could also connect that household to wider exchange. A full cache pit is therefore more than a pantry. It is security. It can also be bargaining power. The same is true of a well-prepared robe or a useful horse in the periods when those things entered broader trade systems. Material abundance creates choices during winter. You can eat stored food instead of making an urgent trip. You can replace a damaged covering. You may be able to exchange surplus for something your household lacks. Again, we should not turn that into a simple modern equation in which wealth equals a warmer room. The sources do not give us a thermostat reading for rich and poor households. The relationship is subtler. Resources increase options. Options reduce some kinds of exposure. And reduced exposure can matter enormously when the air outside is dangerous. Now look at the people doing the work. Women's ownership of Hidatsa earthlodges matters because it prevents us from importing a modern assumption about who controlled the house. Agricultural production matters for the same reason. If women raised much of the food used for consumption and trade, constructed and maintained lodges, prepared hides, cooked, and organized domestic work, then winter security rested heavily on knowledge and authority that older outsider histories could easily dismiss as housework. The word is much too small. A roof is not housework when the roof is keeping a family alive far below zero. A cache pit is not a domestic detail when it holds the food between harvests. A robe is not decoration when it becomes a wall around a sleeping body. The household itself is infrastructure. And that may be the most important change in our model so far. We began tonight looking for the missing fireplace. Then, the fireplace broke apart into roof mass, smoke openings, liners, robes, moccasins, fuel, campsites, and stored food. Now those objects break apart again. Behind each one is a person. Behind that person is a relationship. Behind the relationship is a rule about ownership, responsibility, obligation, knowledge, or exchange. Warmth has moved from technology into society. You turn toward the central fire. It is still small, but now you can see why that small fire works at all. A household has gathered the world around it: timber, earth, hide, food, labour, memory, kin, and trade. The flame only releases a little of what all those people have already stored. And winter has one more way to test that system. It can remove a person from the household entirely. You leave the village before sunrise. The house stays behind. That is the moment when every fixed advantage begins to disappear. The packed earth floor, the heavy roof, the cache pit, the wood already stacked near the hearth, the familiar bed, all of it remains where it was built. If you are travelling or hunting, warmth now has to move with you. For the Mandan, that distinction was real. National Park Service interpretation notes that they lived primarily in earth lodge villages, but used hide tipis when hunting bison or otherwise travelling. The change of shelter was not a change of culture. It was a change of problem. A permanent village rewarded mass, storage, and durability. Travel rewarded speed, portability, and the ability to rebuild the occupied space somewhere else. So you carry the house in pieces: poles, cover, liner, robes, tools, food. What cannot travel has to be replaced by the campsite itself. That is why winter movement exposes the logic we have been building toward. A fixed dwelling can hide bad decisions for a while. You may have extra fuel nearby. You may repair a draft tomorrow. You may have stored food underfoot. On the move, margins shrink. If the wind is stronger than expected, the camp is poorly chosen, the robes become wet, or the fuel is scarce. You feel the error almost immediately. The teepee is useful here because it is not trying to imitate an earth lodge. Smithsonian teaching material on the Ocheti Shakoi describes teepees as structures adapted to Great Plains life, capable of being taken down or erected in a matter of hours, shaped for stability in strong winds, and modified with insulation in winter. With a fire inside, they could protect occupants from severe cold. But could protect is more accurate than stayed warm. The structure creates opportunity. People still have to use it well. You reach the chosen camp, and the first work is not making yourself comfortable. It is converting open ground into protected space. The poles rise. The cover wraps around them. The lower interior is arranged. Robes and belongings come inside. The fire area is established. The opening above it has to remain useful for smoke. Nothing is automatic. And, because the shelter is portable, every part carries a transport cost. A thick earth wall can stay where it is for years. A winter robe has to ride with you. Extra food has to ride with you. An extra pole has to ride with you. Anything that improves tonight may make tomorrow's move harder. This is where portability becomes a form of discipline. Take too little, and the night punishes you. Take too much, and the journey punishes you. The best system is not the one with the most insulation. It is the one whose pieces justify their weight. The bison robe is almost perfect for seeing this trade-off. National Park Service research on the robe trade notes that hides taken during the colder months produce the dense-haired robes wanted for winter use. Native women processed those hides through labour-intensive scraping, softening, and smoking. In the 19th century trade, prime winter robes became valuable commodities, but within the household they were also practical cold-weather material. Wrapped around a sleeping body, a robe does something a wall cannot. It travels. That sounds almost too simple, but it changes the entire heating strategy. If the body can carry a thick insulating layer, then the shelter does not have to perform every task itself. The teepee reduces wind exposure and contains a working fire. The robe creates a much smaller protected zone immediately around the sleeper. One layer catches what another misses. That is the new mechanism. Redundancy, not duplication. If the air inside the shelter cools after the fire drops, the robe still matters. If a person steps outside, clothing still matters. If the camp is moved, the bedding moves. If the shelter cannot provide the thermal mass of an earth lodge, the household does not lose every other defense at the same time. Winter is answered in layers. Now the reason for traveling becomes important. For many plains communities, Bison hunting was not an optional excursion added to village life. It supplied food and materials that fed directly back into clothing, bedding, teepee covers, tools, and trade. MPS describes the Mandan as using teepees during bison hunts, while Smithsonian material on the Northern Cheyenne emphasizes bison as central to food and to materials used for robes, lodge covers, and other necessities. So leaving the warm house can be part of producing future warmth. That is a sharp reversal. The hunt exposes you to cold. A successful hunt can provide meat and hides that help the household through cold later. Winter travel consumes stored energy while also seeking the materials that replenish it. The system has to spend warmth to make warmth possible. And sometimes, the best winter location was chosen precisely because it reduced that spending. Historical material on Cheyenne winter trading describes big timbers along the Arkansas River as a favored wintering ground. Traders such as William Bent went to native camps during the cold season rather than expecting people to leave the bison range and travel all the way to the fort simply to exchange robes. The commercial story comes from 19th century sources and carries the biases of the traders who wrote it, but it confirms a practical reality. Winter camps were connected to hunting grounds, timber, movement, and the cost of distance. Distance is heat. Walk farther for wood, and you spend more time exposed. Travel farther to trade, and you spend food and effort. Choose a camp badly, and every daily task grows longer. Portable shelter does not erase geography. It makes geography more important. By late afternoon, the camp has become a small working world again. The fire is lit. Robes are arranged. Food appears. People settle into the interior. The structure that was a bundle this morning now has an inside and an outside. That transformation is easy to romanticize because the teepee is visually beautiful. But its power is more practical than picturesque. It creates a temporary boundary that can be carried through a changing landscape. And a boundary is exactly what cold forces you to build. First, the landscape slows the wind. Then the cover slows it again. Then the liner shapes the air closer to the occupied space. Then clothing and robes defend the body. Then metabolism supplies heat from food. Then the fire replaces some of what is still being lost. No single layer has to win against winter by itself. That is why losing the permanent house does not mean losing the entire heating system. Most of the system was never the house alone. It was the relationship between body, material, fuel, food, place, labor, and movement. Night settles over the camp. The earth lodge is somewhere behind you now, beyond the dark. You cannot reach its thick roof. You cannot reach its stored cache. But you are not carrying nothing. You are carrying selected pieces of the old solution in a form that can travel. And that reveals a deeper rule. The most resilient winter technology is not always the heaviest one. Sometimes it is the one that can survive being taken apart. Tomorrow, however, winter will attack something even more difficult to replace. Dryness. You step into the snow and immediately discover that cold has an accomplice. Water. The air can be well below freezing and still leave you dry. That is dangerous enough. But add melted snow, sweat, damp bedding, or wet footwear, and the problem changes. Modern cold stress guidance makes the physics plain. Moisture increases heat loss, and wet feet can lose heat far faster than dry ones. That modern science does not prove exactly how every native household described the sensation, but it helps explain why winter clothing, shelter, and daily routines had to manage more than temperature. Look down at the moccasins again. A Knife River National Park Service interpretation notes that Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara winter moccasins could be made larger so fur or grasses could be placed inside for insulation. Higher flaps and leggings could also protect the ankle and foot in deep snow. But snow creates a second problem. Snow sticks, then it melts. A warm foot inside a cold outer layer can produce moisture even when no stream has been crossed. Walking produces heat, The body sweats. Snow enters around the ankle. A person who is comfortable while moving can become much colder after stopping. That is why more clothing is not a complete answer. Clothing has to remain useful. You return to the lodge and sit near the hearth. The moccasins come off. The insulating material inside can be checked. Damp items can be moved into the warmer interior rather than left against frozen ground. The sources do not give us one continent-wide rule for precisely how every nation dried every pair of moccasins, and we should not invent one. What they do show is a winter footwear system designed with insulating material and protection from deep snow. That design creates options. If grass becomes crushed or damp, it is not the entire shoe. If a lining can be replaced, the footwear can recover. The outer moccasin protects one layer. The inner material protects another. Your foot sits at the center. Once again, winter is being answered with boundaries rather than one enormous source of heat. Now pull the robe around yourself. The same problem follows you upward. Bison supplied much of the clothing material used by Mandan and Hidatsa communities of the Upper Great Plains, and Knife River interpretation describes the buffalo robe as a basic article of clothing. Materials and garment forms still varied by community, period, and circumstance. If a robe becomes wet, the household has more work. It must be brought somewhere protected. It must be kept away from open flame while exposed to enough warmth and moving air to dry. That is a physical inference, not a documented universal drying ritual. The evidence lets us see open hearths, bedding, hide clothing, and ventilated shelters. It does not let us claim that every family placed wet robes in the same position after a storm. The distinction matters because winter knowledge often lived in choices too ordinary to be written down. Where do you put the wet object? How close is too close to sparks? Can another layer replace it while it dries? Does the weather offer dry, cold, blowing powder, heavy wet snow, or freezing rain? Those decisions change faster than architecture. The earth lodge roof cannot reinvent itself every hour. A person can. That flexibility becomes especially important inside a teepee. Smithsonian material on the Oceti Shakoi describes teepees as adaptable for winter insulation and capable of protecting occupants from frigid temperatures when used with an internal fire. But a fire still creates smoke, so shelter design has to manage ventilation as well as warmth. You have competing needs again. Keep heat, release smoke, keep snow out, allow air to move, protect the bedding, avoid sparks. A modern sealed house hides many of these negotiations inside chimneys, insulation, vents, and mechanical systems. Here, the people inside can see, smell, and feel the negotiation directly. Smoke drifts where the draft is wrong. Snow enters where the cover is poorly arranged. A robe feels damp. A fire burns badly when fuel is wet. Your feet tell you what the moccasins are doing. There is little distance between failure and feedback. Fuel has its own moisture problem. A pile of wood contains potential heat only if it can burn usefully. Earlier, we saw that some Haudenosaunee longhouses used entrance spaces for storing heavy firewood, while kindling could be kept beneath interior sleeping compartments. Historical descriptions collected by the New York State Museum explicitly mention dry winter wood being stored inside and an outer vestibule serving as a winter woodshed. And once again, preparation moves backward in time. You do not begin solving tonight's wet firewood problem when the flames are already dying. You gather earlier. You bring wood under protection. You keep reserves near the occupied space. Winter punishes the household that waits for every problem to become immediate. Now notice what happens when work becomes hard. Gathering fuel, walking through snow, carrying loads, hunting, and pitching a lodge can make a person sweat even in cold weather. Modern physiology confirms the danger of combining cold with damp clothing because moisture can accelerate heat loss. Native people did not need a scientific equation to learn that practical relationship through experience. Move hard. Become damp. Stop moving. Cool quickly. The sequence is simple. So winter skill includes adjusting activity and clothing to conditions. Not because everyone followed one universal rule, but because every cold weather traveller faces the same boundary. The body produces heat during work and may lose it quickly afterward. This changes our picture of warmth again. A warm winter system is not one that produces the maximum possible heat. Maximum heat can create new problems. A roaring fire consumes fuel. Overheating during hard work can leave clothing damp. Sealing a shelter too tightly traps smoke. Piling bedding carelessly near flames creates danger. The useful system is balanced. Enough fire, enough ventilation, enough insulation, enough dryness, enough stored fuel, enough flexibility to change when conditions change. You hold your moccasins near the edge of the occupied space, not in the flames. Outside, snow continues to fall. Inside, almost nothing dramatic happens. A robe dries slowly. Wood waits under cover. The fire breathes through an opening that also lets some warmth escape. A person adjusts clothing before going outside again. These are not heroic moments. They are maintenance. And maintenance is why the system survives. The deeper lesson is now harder to miss. Cold itself was only one enemy. Wind carried heat away. Distance consumed labour. Hunger reduced the body's fuel. Water weakened insulation. Smoke limited how tightly a house could be closed. Every solution had to answer several pressures at once. That is why the missing modern fireplace matters less with every step. The people we have followed did not defeat winter by producing endless heat. They made heat difficult to lose. They kept materials useful. They stored what could be stored. And they adjusted before discomfort became catastrophe. But there is one material we have treated almost like background so far. Snow. In some places, snow was not merely weather falling on the shelter. It could become part of the shelter itself. The snow beneath your boots is no longer just something to cross. Farther north, in Arctic North America, it can become building material. That requires an immediate correction. Inuit peoples are not simply the northern version of the Plains nations we have been following. And snow houses were never one universal indigenous North American winter solution. Arctic communities developed their own architectures around very different materials, animals, travel patterns, coastlines, and temperatures. Smithsonian Material on Arctic Culture stresses that people learn to build with what the environment actually supplied, including snow, while archaeological evidence from Alaska also preserves long traditions of semi-subterranean houses built from driftwood, whalebone, sod, and turf. So the useful comparison is not everyone did the same thing. It is the opposite. The same physical problem produced different answers because the available material changed. You kneel beside a block of compacted snow. It looks like frozen weather. In the right conditions, however, snow contains enormous amounts of trapped air between ice crystals. That trapped air slows heat transfer. The principle is the same reason fur works so well. The useful part is not simply the solid material, but the still air held within and around it. National Park Service interpretation of caribou fur makes this explicit, noting that its insulating power comes from air trapped within hollow hairs and between them. Now the title changes again. Warmth does not always come from adding something hot. Sometimes it comes from making air stop moving. A snow wall can do that. A fur layer can do that. Grass packed into footwear can do that. An earth roof can do that. A tipi liner can help control the moving air that would otherwise sweep through the occupied zone. The materials look completely different. The mechanism keeps returning. You move into a temporary snow shelter, and the first sensation is not warmth in the modern sense. There is no reason to expect a room that feels like a heated bedroom. The important change is that the wind has disappeared. Your body is no longer trying to warm an endless volume of Arctic air that is being replaced every second. The shelter gives you a smaller problem. That may be the most powerful idea in this entire story. Winter outdoors is effectively infinite. You cannot heat the landscape. You can only make the space that matters smaller. First, a campsite reduces exposure. Then a house reduces it again. Then a sleeping platform or household compartment reduces the useful zone. Then a robe reduces it to the space around the body. Then fur reduces it to tiny pockets of air beside the skin. At each step, the problem contracts. Fire comes last. Arctic clothing shows this with unusual clarity. National Park Service documentation of Nunavut clothing and tents describes caribou skin with the fur left on as an exceptional insulating material because air is trapped inside the hollow hairs and between them. Builders could also use multiple hide layers in shelter construction. The outer hides were prepared with waterproof stitching, showing again that warmth and moisture control could not be separated. You run a hand over the fur. The hairs do not feel like a fireplace. They are doing the opposite job. The fireplace produces heat rapidly and loses much of it into a room. The fur produces nothing. It simply makes the body's existing heat harder to surrender. That is why clothing can outperform architecture at the smallest scale. It follows every movement. It protects you while hunting, traveling, sitting, or sleeping. And when the environment provides little timber, protecting the body directly becomes even more important. Snow itself can then extend that logic outward. The Smithsonian's Arctic climate material describes snow house building as one of the technologies developed for life in the far north. But even there, permanent winter architecture was broader than the famous dome that modern popular culture tends to picture. Archaeological evidence from coastal Alaska includes semi-subterranean houses made with driftwood frames, sometimes whalebone, and coverings of sod and turf. In Labrador, Smithsonian archaeological work has documented Inuit houses combining wooden frames with sod walls used for insulation. The pattern should look familiar now. Go partly into the ground. Add material that traps air. Reduce exposed surface. Control the doorway. Keep the occupied zone protected. Use whatever fuel and light the setting allows. Put dense insulation between bodies and wind. The earthlodge of the Missouri and an Arctic sod house are not versions of the same cultural invention. Their histories are distinct. But cold does not care about cultural boundaries. The physics keeps asking similar questions. How quickly is air moving? How much surface is exposed? Where is moisture going? How much material can be gathered? How much fuel exists nearby? How many people must the structure serve? How permanent does it need to be? The answers become culture because people solve those questions through local knowledge, inherited design, labor, available animals, social relationships, and repeated experience. That is why saying, "they just used snow," would be as shallow as saying the Mandan just used dirt. Snow has to be suitable. A shelter has to be shaped. An entrance has to work. Clothing has to cooperate with the structure. People have to recognize when the material is good enough to use. Modern Canadian climate reporting even notes that changing snow quality can make traditional igloo construction more difficult today. A reminder that snow is not one uniform building substance. Its composition matters. That detail pulls us away from another comfortable myth. Traditional knowledge is not a bag of ancient tricks that works automatically. It depends on conditions. Change the snow and a snow building technique may become harder. Change the animal populations and clothing materials become harder to obtain. Change access to land and seasonal movement changes. Change fuel availability and the hearth changes. Change the household and labor changes. The system survives only while people can read the materials available to them. You step back outside. The cold is still severe. Nothing about the shelter has changed the weather. That is the midpoint failure in our original model. At the beginning, the question seemed to be, how did people create enough heat without a modern fireplace? Now that question is too small. The more successful strategies often did not begin by creating heat at all. They began by reducing the amount of world the body had to fight. A river bottom camp reduced wind. An earth lodge reduced exposed air. A longhouse divided a huge interior into useful family zones. A tipi liner controlled draft close to the floor. A robe enclosed one person. Caribou hair enclosed microscopic pockets of air. Snow could become a wall because the air trapped inside it refused to move quickly. The system is nested. Landscape around shelter. Shelter around household. Bedding around body. Material around skin. Air inside material. Only after all of that do we return to flame. And once you see the layers, a modern fireplace begins to look strangely extravagant. It tries to compensate for heat loss by producing more heat. These older systems often spent enormous labor reducing the loss first. That did not make winter easy. It made winter manageable. There is one final pressure that can break even a beautifully layered system. You can have the right house, the right clothing, dry bedding, stored food, and good fuel. Then someone becomes sick. And suddenly the body itself stops behaving like the reliable little furnace the whole system was built around. You wake because someone beside you is coughing. The fire is still there. The roof is still heavy with earth. Robes are still piled around the sleeping places. Food is stored, wood is close. Nothing obvious has failed. But the person under the robe is not producing or conserving heat as easily as yesterday. That matters because every winter system we have followed depends on the body doing part of the work. Cold exposure forces the body to defend its core temperature. Shivering is one response, and fatigue, confusion, and loss of coordination are warning signs when cold stress becomes severe. Modern physiology gives us those terms. It does not tell us exactly how a Hidatsa grandmother or Mandan child described a sensation 2 centuries ago. The historical point is simpler. A shelter can reduce heat loss, but it cannot make a weakened body irrelevant. Now look around the earth lodge. At Knife River, a lodge commonly housed 10 to 20 people, often sisters and their families, with beds arranged around the outer ring and a central fire in the middle. National Park Service interpretation describes multiple generations cooking, eating, visiting, and sleeping in the same structure. That arrangement means vulnerability is visible. A person who is tired, injured, very young, old, or sick does not have to solve every winter task alone. Someone else can bring wood. Someone else can cook. Someone else can fetch stored food. Someone else can adjust bedding, tend the fire, or take over work that would otherwise pull the weakened person outside. The sources do not give us permission to invent a sentimental scene in which every household always cared perfectly for every member. Human families have never been that simple. But shared architecture creates the physical possibility of shared labor. In a lodge containing relatives across generations, one person's reduced capacity does not automatically remove every other part of the system. That is an inference from the documented multi-generational household structure rather than a record of every family's behavior. That is another form of insulation. Not material insulation. Social insulation. You stay near the bed while another person crosses the lodge to the hearth. The distance is short. That matters more now than it did when everyone was healthy. The house concentrates necessary things: fire, food, bedding, tools, relatives, and stored goods. A person who cannot spend long outside may still remain close to the activities keeping the household functioning. Knife River descriptions place sleeping, storage, family activity, and the central hearth within the same earth lodge interior. This is why the shape of domestic life matters to winter history. A roof protects bodies. A household protects capacities. The two are not the same thing. Now watch what happens when one capacity disappears. The person who normally gathers wood cannot go. The fire still needs fuel. The task moves to someone else. The person who prepares food is exhausted. The food still has to be prepared. The task moves again. A child needs more attention. An elder moves more slowly. A hunting trip returns late. Warmth survives because work can be redistributed. But redistribution has a cost. Other people carry more. Other tasks wait. Stored reserves shrink. The household becomes less flexible. That is where winter begins to expose the difference between having resources and having slack. A full cache pit gives options. A large supply of dry fuel gives options. Several capable adults give options. Good robes give options. None of them guarantees safety, but each one buys time when something goes wrong. And time is one of the quietest forms of warmth. You do not have to leave immediately. You do not have to hunt today. You do not have to gather the next armful of wood in the middle of the storm. Preparation turns emergency into delay. Delay can become recovery. Now make the failure larger. In 1837, smallpox struck the upper Missouri villages with devastating force. National Park Service histories record catastrophic mortality among the Mandan and severe losses among the Hidatsa and Arikara. The epidemic was not caused by cold weather, and it should not be folded casually into a story about winter exposure. Its importance here is different. It destroyed people inside the system. The earthlodges did not suddenly forget how to hold heat. The robes did not stop insulating. The cache pits did not stop storing corn. But knowledge, labour, kinship, leadership, and household numbers were shattered. Survivors reorganised and moved. MPS histories describe surviving Mandan and Hidatsa eventually establishing like a fishhook village farther upriver, while Arikara survivors later joined them there. A technical system can survive on paper, while the human system that operates it collapses. That is a much deeper vulnerability than a missing fireplace. You can replace a burned log in minutes. You cannot replace a lodge builder, a gardener, a hunter, a hide worker, a parent, or an elder carrying decades of knowledge in the same way. And this is where our earlier phrase, stored labour, becomes almost literal. Knowledge is stored labour too. A woman who knows how to supervise an earth lodge construction carries solutions that do not exist in the timber itself. A person who knows where winter fuel is easiest to gather carries a map no pile of wood can reproduce. A skilled hide worker knows when material has been scraped enough. A gardener knows which seed to save. A traveller knows which low ground becomes dangerous and which timber offers shelter. When illness removes people, it can remove pieces of the heating system that have no visible chimney, wall, or flame. The house is partly memory. That makes intergenerational living especially important to understand. Knife River interpretation places grandparents, children, and other relatives within the same earth lodge world. Skills could be observed through ordinary life because work happened where people lived. Children did not need a formal lesson called winter thermal management. They watched wood arrive. They watched food being prepared. They watched hides being worked. They watched smoke move. They watched adults respond to weather. The system taught itself through repetition. Not perfectly, not automatically, but physically. A child could see what happened when the door opened in a hard wind. A young person could learn which materials belonged near the hearth and which stayed farther away. Someone could watch a lodge roof being repaired before taking responsibility years later. That is how technology survives without an instruction manual. It lives in repeated action. You look again at the person resting under the robe. The fire has not grown. Nobody has invented a better furnace. Yet the household can make this one body easier to protect by moving work outward from it. That may be the most human part of the answer tonight. Staying warm was never only about how well one person resisted cold. It depended on whether other people could absorb the work when that person could not. The modern fireplace hides this relationship because fuel arrives through systems far outside the room. Electricity comes through a wire, gas arrives through a pipe. The labor is distant. Here, the chain stays visible. Someone gathers, someone stores, someone cooks, someone tends, someone repairs, someone teaches, someone rests because someone else is moving. And then, during the 19th century, more outside goods begin entering that chain. At Upper Missouri trading centers such as Fort Union, native peoples exchanged furs and food for manufactured cloth, trade blankets, kettles, clothing, and metal goods. These materials could make some household tasks easier or add new cold weather layers, but they also tied useful objects more closely to expanding commercial networks. They do not simply replace the old system, they rearrange who and what the household depends on. You walk into the trade room carrying winter with you. Outside, the Missouri is cold. Inside, shelves and bundles contain objects that came from far beyond the river. Wool blankets, cloth, metal kettles, knives, beads, firearms, and other manufactured goods. At Fort Union, operating from 1828 to 1867, Assiniboine, Crow, Cree, Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, Lakota, and other traders exchanged robes, furs, and food for imported merchandise. At first glance, this seems like the moment the old winter system should disappear. Why scrape hides if you can obtain wool? Why rely only on older containers if a metal kettle is available? But that is not what happens. The new goods enter an existing system. A wool blanket can lie over older bedding. Cloth can become clothing. A metal kettle can make cooking easier, while the same hearth still supplies heat. A knife can speed cutting tasks, but it does not gather firewood by itself. The lodge does not stop needing maintenance because someone owns a manufactured pot. The household absorbs the object. That is the important direction of change. National Park Service interpretation at Fort Union notes that manufactured goods such as kettles provided convenient and desirable alternatives to older equipment, especially for women whose daily work made those tools useful. You pick up a trade blanket. It represents additional insulation, but it also represents distance. The wool did not come from the local bison herd. The cloth did not grow in a Hidatsa garden. The kettle was not shaped from nearby earth. These objects arrive through a chain extending from manufacturers to merchants, transport networks, trading posts, interpreters, traders, and native exchange partners. Fort Union inventories and interpretation document imported cloth, blankets, metal goods, and other merchandise moving into Upper Missouri Exchange. Warmth can now depend on people you may never see. That is a new kind of winter architecture. Not a wall around the body, a network around the household. Fort Union's location near the junction of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers helped make it a strategic center, connecting trade routes and numerous plains peoples. NPS historians describe it as a focal point for economic and social exchange, not merely a store where one side sold goods to another. That distinction matters because native communities were active trading powers long before Fort Union appeared. Knife River had already been a major indigenous trade center for centuries. Hidatsa villages exchanged agricultural produce, hides, moccasins, tools, furs, and other goods with visitors. European and American traders entered an existing world of exchange rather than inventing commerce on an empty river. So the network becomes denser, older routes remain, new posts appear, new objects move through them, and the household gains new choices. A choice can be useful without being free. To obtain imported goods, something has to move outward in exchange. On the Upper Missouri, buffalo robes became enormously important. Fort Union's history notes that native traders brought robes and other furs to exchange for manufactured goods. At the post's height, Tens of thousands of buffalo robes could pass through in a year. Now return to the robe on your shoulders. Earlier was stored labour and insulation. Under the expanding robe trade, it can also become merchandise. That changes the pressure around it. A winter hide can keep someone warm at home. The same hide can be processed and traded for blankets, cloth, metal tools, ammunition, or other desired goods. The object has two possible futures. Use it or exchange it. And because the best cold weather commercial robes were taken during the colder months, market demand reached directly into winter hunting and hide processing labour. National Park Service research on the robe trade notes that November through March hides produced the prime heavy robes demanded for winter clothing and carriage robes in American and European markets. The cold season now creates export value. That is a strange reversal. A material adapted to protecting a plains household from winter becomes valuable to distant consumers who also want protection from winter. The robe leaves the plains. A blanket may return, but these objects connect the body to different systems. The bison hide comes from an animal embedded in local hunting, food, craft, mobility and ecology. The imported blanket comes through a commercial chain whose supply can be affected far away. That does not make one automatically better. It makes the household more connected. Connection creates options when the network works. It can create vulnerability when the network fails. Fort Union itself survived less than 40 years. Commercial competition changed. Demand changed. Transport changed. Animal populations were heavily pressured. Disease moved through expanding contact networks. MPS interpretation of Fort Union describes the fur trade as producing both valuable exchange and severe consequences, including depleted fur supplies and devastating epidemics among native trading partners. So we have reached another model failure. At the beginning of tonight, traditional winter life could look isolated. A family in a lodge, using local materials, somehow independent of the wider world. It was never that simple. Trade was already part of life. Then, 19th century commercial networks dramatically widened the distances involved. A household on the upper Missouri might sleep beneath local hides while cooking in an imported kettle and owning cloth that had crossed an ocean. Old and new technologies could occupy the same room. That coexistence is more useful than a story about one replacing the other overnight. You set the blanket down. Beside it is a buffalo robe. One came through industrial production and long-distance commerce. The other came through hunting and many hours of skilled processing. Both can cover a body, but they connect that body to different systems of labour. That is what technological change often does. It does not eliminate dependence. It moves dependence around. A metal kettle may reduce one kind of work while increasing the value of goods needed to obtain it. A blanket may add warmth while tying the household more closely to a trading post. An imported object can be genuinely useful and still make disruptions somewhere else more consequential. The winter system becomes larger than the village. And once that happens, forces far beyond the hearth begin entering the story. Markets, commercial hunting, disease, government policy, military pressure, dispossession. We will not turn the remaining story into a catalogue of catastrophe. The important point is narrower. Warmth had always depended on access. Access to land. Access to timber. Access to bison or other animals. Access to stored food. Access to family labour. Access to trade partners. Once those forms of access were disrupted, knowing how to build a warm lodge was not enough. The knowledge could survive while the conditions required to use it were taken away. You leave the trade room and step outside again. The blanket under your arm is useful. The metal kettle is useful. Nobody needs to pretend otherwise. But the older robe suddenly looks different. Not because it is more authentic, because it reminds you that every warm object has a supply chain. Some supply chains begin at a factory. Some begin with an animal, a garden, a tree, or a patch of usable snow. All of them depend on continued access. And winter becomes far more dangerous when somebody else gains the power to decide what you can reach. You follow the supply chain until it reaches a fence. The change is easy to miss at first because nothing about heat transfer has changed. A robe still slows heat loss, timber still burns, earth still moderates temperature, a sheltered river bottom still breaks the wind. What changes is whether people can reach those things. For the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, the 19th century brought repeated disruptions that narrowed the land base on which older seasonal systems depended. After devastating smallpox epidemics, many surviving Mandan and Hidatsa established like a fishhook village in 1845. Arikara families joined them later. National Park Service histories then trace the communities into the Fort Berthold Reservation era, as United States policy increasingly restricted native land and movement. Now the word warmth has to carry more weight. A winter system built around mobility assumes that movement remains possible. A hunting system built around bison assumes that bison remain available. A household using local timber assumes that access to timber continues. A garden and cache system assumes access to productive soil and water. Remove the access and the knowledge does not become foolish. It becomes harder to use. That distinction matters. There is a lazy version of this history, in which indigenous technologies simply become obsolete when manufactured goods arrive. The evidence points to something more complicated. Trade blankets, metal tools, kettles, and later new building forms could be adopted because they were useful. At the same time, the older system was being pressured by forces that had nothing to do with whether it worked. Fort Union's decline, for example, came as United States policy changed and bison herds were depleted. You cannot improve a bison robe if the bison disappears. That is not technological failure. It is ecological and political disruption. The robe had once connected several needs at once. The animal provided food, hide could become clothing, bedding, shelter material, containers, or trade goods. Sinew could become thread. Hunting connected movement, labor, food, and material supply. When bison populations collapsed across the plains in the 19th century, every one of those relationships came under pressure. Smithsonian educational material on Plains Treaty history documents that United States officials even discussed bison destruction as a way to undermine the subsistence base of plains peoples. The missing animal leaves an architectural hole, not because a bison was a fireplace, because the winter system had been layered. Remove one layer and the others have to carry more. Imported blankets may replace some insulating function. Purchased food may replace some calories. A different house may replace a hide lodge. But replacement changes dependence. You need cash, rations, trade access, government distribution, wage work, transportation, or another route to the new material. The household is still solving winter. The network around the household is different. Then land itself changes again. In the 20th century, the construction of Garrison Dam on the Missouri River forced another major relocation for the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara National Park Service material. States that the dam's floodwaters destroyed homes, communities, roads, tribal headquarters, sawmills, and other parts of the three affiliated tribes' social and economic infrastructure. Think about that, without rushing past the ordinary objects. A road is a winter object when it connects you to fuel. A sawmill is a winter object when lumber is part of housing. A river-bottom field is a winter object when its harvest becomes stored food. A neighborhood is a winter object when relatives share work. A familiar landscape is a winter object when people know where the wind cuts hardest, where timber grows, where water sits, and which routes remain passable. Flood the landscape, and you do not merely move houses. You break connections between things. That is why the word infrastructure fits here. The old earth lodge already taught us that warmth came from relationships among materials, roof, doorway, hearth, beds, food, and people worked together. Now scale that idea up. Land is connected to food. Food is connected to labour. Labour is connected to households. Households are connected to roads, water, fuel, relatives, trade, and memory. A forced relocation rearranges all of it at once. Still, this is not an ending about disappearance. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara did not become people without history because their material conditions changed. Smithsonian Native Knowledge 360 describes the three affiliated tribes today as distinct peoples joined in the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, with continuing connections to their Missouri River homelands, farming traditions, hunting, and trade history. Continuity does not require pretending nothing changed. In fact, continuity becomes more impressive when change is admitted. A family can live in a framed house and still carry knowledge descended from an earth lodge world. A manufactured blanket can lie beside an object made by hand. A modern heating system can enter a community whose older architecture already understood draft, insulation, thermal mass, layered clothing, seasonal movement, and fuel economy. Technology accumulates. People adapt it. The mistake is imagining a clean line from primitive to modern, as if the appearance of a stove suddenly taught people what cold was. They already knew cold intimately. They knew it through feet in snow, smoke in the eyes, frozen river bottoms, wet hides, stored corn, wind against lodge covers, and the weight of wood being carried home. The new technology changes the tools available. It does not invent the problem, and it does not erase the intelligence of the older solutions. You can see that now because our original question has almost turned inside out. How did Native Americans stay warm without modern fireplaces? Sounded as if something essential was missing. But the fireplace was never the standard against which these systems should be judged. A fireplace is one answer to one part of the problem. The systems we have followed answered many parts at once. Where should the shelter stand? How much wind should reach the body? How should smoke escape? What can trap still air? Where should food be stored? How far away is fuel? What must remain dry? Who has the knowledge? Who performs the labour? What happens when someone cannot? What happens when movement is restricted? What happens when the animal, forest, field, or river you depend on becomes inaccessible? Those questions are larger than the fire. And now, near the end of the night, we can finally return to the first earth lodge, without seeing it as a dark room waiting for a better invention. You duck through the entrance again. The central hearth is still there, but it is no longer the centre of the explanation. Around it are the things that made the flame enough. Earth, wood, robes, food, bodies, memory, work, access. The room is quiet now. There is only one question left. What exactly kept you warm? You are back inside the earth lodge where the night began. The fire has settled lower now. No one needs to explain it to you anymore. You can see why the room still works, even when the flames are modest. The thick roof has already slowed the outside cold. The entrance has already broken the wind. The beds keep people away from the busiest part of the floor. Robes hold warmth close. Food has already been stored. Wood has already been carried. The household has already done most of the work before this quiet hour arrives. That is the answer. Native peoples across North America did not stay warm because they had one secret substitute for a modern fireplace. Different communities built different winter systems from the materials, landscapes, animals, and social arrangements available to them. Earth lodges, longhouses, tipis, fur clothing, layered bedding, snow shelters, stored food, sheltered campsites, and carefully managed hearths all solved different pieces of the same problem. The fire mattered. But the fire was never working alone. You shift closer to the bed. The distinction feels almost obvious now. A modern fireplace suggests that warmth begins at the flame and spreads outward. Many of the systems we have followed worked in the opposite direction. They first reduced the amount of heat the body had to lose. Wind was slowed before it reached the skin. Air was trapped in fir grass, snow, earth, or layered walls. Sleeping spaces concentrated warmth around people rather than demanding uniform comfort everywhere. Food supplied the body. Dry materials, preserved insulation. Fuel was stored before the coldest hours. The landscape itself could be chosen to make every later task easier. Then the hearth supplied what was still needed. This is not a story about people being tougher than winter. That idea gives too much credit to endurance and too little to design. Cold hurts whether the person feeling it lives in 1820 or 2026. Feet go numb. Wet material becomes dangerous. Wind steals heat. Hunger weakens the body. Smoke makes a badly managed shelter miserable. People responded by building systems that reduce those pressures enough for ordinary life to continue. Ordinary life is the important part. A family still has to eat. Someone still has to mend something. Children still need attention. Tools still break. People still travel. Someone still wakes, tired. Someone still wishes the woodpile were closer. Winter technology succeeds when those boring problems remain manageable. That is why the most revealing objects tonight have often been unimpressive. A strip of liner hanging inside a teepee. Grass inside a moccasin. A cache pit under the ground. A piece of bark moved over a smoke opening. A stack of wood near a doorway. A robe folded over a sleeping place. None of these looks like a machine. Together, they behave like one. And then there are the things that do not look like technology at all. Knowledge of where to camp. Knowledge of how to fit a covering. Knowledge of when a hide is ready. Knowledge of which food must be stored now because it will be needed months later. Knowledge of how much ventilation a fire requires. Knowledge passed through people who watched, worked, corrected, and remembered. The house could be rebuilt because the design existed in living memory before it existed in timber. That is why losing access to land, animals, labor, or community could damage the system so deeply. A roof can be copied. A relationship to place is harder to reproduce. A blanket can replace some insulation. It cannot replace the knowledge of a river bottom, the location of fuel, the timing of a harvest, or the network of relatives who divide winter work among themselves. The technology was never only material. It was practiced. You look toward the doorway. For most of the night, cold has been waiting beyond it. That is where our first assumption failed. We imagined a contest between indoor fire and outdoor winter. But the better systems did not wait until cold crossed the threshold. They answered it farther away. At the campsite, at the tree line, in the roof, in the stored food, in the clothing, in the work done months earlier. By the time the flame was asked to help, winter had already been weakened several times. That is the deeper truth behind the title. Native Americans stayed warm without modern fireplaces by refusing to make the fireplace responsible for everything. Not consciously in those modern words, of course. The principle appears in the things people built and used. Reduce exposure. Trap useful air. Protect the body. Keep materials dry. Store food and fuel. Share labor. Adapt the shelter to the season. Use the landscape rather than fight it blindly. And accept that comfort did not mean turning winter into summer. The room could still be smoky. The doorway could still be cold. The floor could still chill bare feet. The fire could still need attention. A robe could still feel heavy. A storm could still overwhelm preparation. Nothing about these systems made winter harmless. They made life possible inside it. The last firewood shifts in the hearth. A small orange edge appears, brightens, then settles. Around it, the lodge is mostly shadow. You no longer need to inspect the roof. You already know the earth is above you. You no longer need to trace the path to the woodpile. Someone made that trip before dark. You no longer need to open the cache. The food is there because another season was turned into winter security. The visible flame is only the final link. Outside, the Missouri country lies under cold air and dark sky. Farther east, another longhouse holds families along a central aisle. Farther across the plains, a portable lodge stands against the wind. Farther north, fur and snow create smaller pockets of protected air around human bodies. The continent does not share one house. It shares the problem, and every answer belongs to a particular people, place, season, and history. Now the world gets smaller again. The river disappears beyond the walls. The village becomes quiet. The lodge becomes one room. The room becomes one sleeping place near the outer wall. A robe settles over the body beneath it. The air inside that small space warms slowly from the person already there. No great blaze is needed. No brick chimney waits overhead. There is only a little stored heat, protected carefully. The body relaxes. The hands stop moving. The fire softens to red. Smoke finds its way upward. Cold remains outside the layers it has not yet crossed. And the last thing you notice is not the flame. It is how little the flame has to do. The earth holds. The robe holds. The room holds. The people have done what they can. Your breathing slows beneath the covers. One breath warms the small pocket of air near your face. Then another. The lodge does not conquer winter. It simply gives the body enough shelter to rest inside it. The coals darken. The roof stays still. And for a while, nothing else is required.